Hello, it's Friday morning, and that means it's time to have a great conversation with the brilliant and wonderful Joti Brar. Let's talk. Good morning, all. Garland Nixon here. I've had some people ask me about this T-shirt, "Obey, Consume, etc." It's actually from a movie called They Live, which is a very interesting kind of cult classic. You'll notice the little eyeglasses with the weird people. Interesting movie. It's in fact, I think Jody would love it. It's these basically in this movie, the ruling elite have made a deal with these aliens to kind of run the planet, and the masses don't know about it. And you put these glasses on, and you can see them for what they really are. And a big part of it is this guy fighting because he doesn't want the glasses on. So he can, he doesn't believe it. And so he literally gets in this big fist fight to keep from being enlightened as to what the ruling elite are really up to. It's a cult classic. It's really, really good. They Live. It's a simplistic kind of movie. One of those almost B movies that the message is so interesting, people love it. And with a former champion pro wrestler named Roddy Piper, They Live. Interesting, and that's what it comes from. And here's the interesting thing: when you look at like the advertisements on the billboards and stuff like that, and it'll just say, whatever, buy this super razors. When you put on the glasses, you can see that it really says obey, conform, consume, stay asleep. So those are the real messages that the ruling elite are giving everyone, but you can't see them because they're subliminal messages. They're going to your brain. So it's really, really, like I said, it's an interesting darn movie. One of those Matrix kind of movies in a much simplest, with a much lower budget. How about that? Okay.
I would have to watch it.
Yeah. Oh, it's a must. It's a must. And but at any rate, we are not going to stay asleep. We're going to be awakened by the great Joti Brar. You and I had a discussion recently on my radio show. I was very happy to have you in DC. Got great feedback. And one of the things that we talked about that people have to understand, and this is a conversation that is had out there, but it isn't discussed well enough by people that know the history. So post World War II, this issue about the Nazis, right? And what we hear is that, Winston Churchill and the US and all of the colonial imperialist powers who were doing at least as bad as what he was doing, all over the world, were just outraged by his evilness. And they all came together and fought to stop the evil Hitler and the imperialist Japan. And afterwards, all was well. But that wasn't quite the case, was it, Jody? Let's get your take on World War II and the imperialist and neocon powers' positions and what happened afterwards.
Just a small thing, Garland, just a small thing. Just sum up all that stuff. Okay, very, very, very potted history, and forgive me, all the people, for all the things that I will leave out.
And don't take your time, no rush. Okay, we got an hour, so take your time, whatever you need to put in here, because I really want to learn about this. Go ahead.
Okay, well, I think the fundamental thing to understand about World War II was that it changed its character. It wasn't the same war in 1931 that it was 1939 that it was in 1941 in Europe, and I'll explain myself. In 1939. Britain declared war on Germany. They said it was to do with Poland. What it really was to do with was exactly the same thing that World War I was to do with. It was a fight between two rival imperialist powers over the shares of loot of the world, over who was going to be able to dominate and loot which parts of the globe. And Germany, as a rising imperialist power, just like during World War I, felt aggrieved that it didn't have enough of the world for its finance capital, for its monopolists to loot and exploit exclusively. Right? Britain in particular, as the biggest empire in the world, the first capitalist power to become a monopolist and expand into the globe and corner colonial territory, had grabbed for itself a huge proportion of the Earth's surface, and that meant the world's resources and exploitable human beings, right? And we've talked about this before, I think, Garland, that the original style of imperialism, the colonial empires, enabled countries to have a monopoly of the market and the raw materials in these colonies abroad. You know, when Britain controlled India, it was able to control entirely the market of India because it physically occupied it, ran the country, and so the market was a monopoly for British producers to sell into and loot from, right? And they didn't have to worry about being competitive with anyone else in the world market. There was no world market in India. India was a closed market for the British, right? And that was the same with all the colonial territories. Now, as a rising imperialist, young, thrusting with more advanced industry and technology, and very kind of energetic finance capitalist class, but very limited access to colonial spheres, to markets abroad, which imperialist powers need, Germany went to war twice to try to grab territory. First World War failed, it was punished, but German finance capital remained. They crushed what was a very strong prospect of a successful German revolution was crushed with the help of Germany's version of the Labour Party. The Social Democratic Party was brought into power to crush the communist movement. Once it had done that, it handed power to Hitler, refused to oppose him because they said, well, he's come through democratic mandate through an election, you know, but the process of turning Germany from nearly communist to fascist was facilitated, must never be forgotten, by Germany's Labour Party. It was the Social Democrats who did that job of saving German imperialism twice. Once actually wiping out, executing the leaders of the revolution, executing the strongest communist leaders, drowning that revolutionary movement in blood. Many German workers were killed in that process by a social democratic government, and then creating the groundwork for the fascists to be brought to power. And the fascists were there to manage the crisis in a military way, to keep the working class down and to militarize Germany so it could go and restart the process of trying to grab territory abroad. And this process was facilitated by other imperialist powers. They were very happy to see the threat of communism in Germany crushed. They facilitated that process in every way that they could. They facilitated the rise of Hitler. Churchill was happy with Mussolini, happy with Hitler. He wasn't a great anti-fascist, nor were the presidents in the USA great anti-fascists. They were very happy to see fascists come to power to suppress the working class. That was their job. Their job was to save an imperialist system in each country that was in crisis. Don't forget that the 1930s, starting 1929, was the time of the Great Depression, right? Which until that moment was the worst ever crisis that the global capitalist system had seen. And precisely because it was global, it was so deep, there's no way to export your way out of a global crisis. You can only fight your way out of it. You've got to expand, and your expansion is going to come at the expense of somebody. So when Germany was militarizing, full support from the other imperialist powers, they wanted to point Germany eastwards. If German expansion, if German imperialist domination came at the cost of Eastern Europe and of the Soviet Union, all well and good. And if they could kill two birds with one stone and get the Nazi Germany or German state fighting the USSR, if they could get Germany to bring down the USSR, but also in the process weaken itself in terms of, its strength vis-a-vis the other imperialists, happy days all around. That was the thinking of the leaders of British imperialism, of US imperialism, of French imperialism, they all wanted to see that same thing happen. That is why you see this, that to a lot of people, they're like, why were the anti-fascists in the democratic countries, which is what they call the non-fascist imperialist countries, i.e. they didn't have fascism at home. They always use fascist methods abroad in their colonies, right? So there's not really such a thing as a non-fascist imperialist. But in terms of the way they keep power at home, they prefer democracy. They prefer social peace at home, and they have to export fascism abroad because it's the only way to, or fascist methods, it's the only way to control these territories that you're just rinsing for all that they've got. So a lot of people look at World War II, the run up through the 30s, and they're like, why did these governments constantly appease the fascists when they were so obviously crazed warmongers? And the answer is, they identified with them. They had a strategy that they thought was very clever, that Germany could expand, at the expense of the Soviet Union, and that in the process of a war with the USSR, Germany would also, get a bit weaker, which would be, then mean that, France and Britain would continue in the old way without any threat to their imperial power across Asia and Africa. That didn't happen. So there was a whole round of appeasements, negotiations and treaties. We know that, for example, Czechoslovakia was allowed to be conquered by Germany with no objection, basically, from the West. They're like, okay, yes, have that. That's fine. Just keep going that way. And the French and the British and many other countries in Eastern Europe all made treaties with Hitler's Germany, non-aggression pacts of various kinds, peace treaties, peace agreements. And all of it was with the aim of pointing Germany at the Soviet Union. That's what they hoped would happen. But during this period, the leadership of the USSR, Stalin, Molotov, the various people involved in international politics from the Soviet side, obviously they saw what was happening. They understood, the main enemy of imperialism is us because we're the land of socialism, right? And socialism is the ultimate threat to imperialism. Socialism is the future of all the imperialist countries. It's the future they're all trying really hard to avoid. So they understood this is what was happening. For many years, they tried very hard, the Soviets, to get a mutual defense treaty going with Poland, with France, with Britain. All of those countries basically said no, and sometimes in very insulting ways. They would send very low-level officials who didn't really have the power to negotiate anything, and it was just time wasting. Meanwhile, they're all signing deals with Hitler. So at the very last minute, Stalin's USSR basically pulled the rug out from under their whole machinations by concluding a non-aggression pact with Germany. And what that meant was, for the time being, they never imagined this is going to be forever. They knew they were only buying themselves space, but they also had the feeling that what they were going to do then was force the British and the French into a situation where they would have to be allies with the Soviet Union rather than enemies of it. Because Germany was hell-bent on conquering territory one way or the other. So having signed that pact with the USSR in 1939, then they turned, instead of turning east, they turned west. And they started, obviously they went into Poland, which was part of the kind of what had been expected, but that triggered a war with Britain. And that triggered the march of the fascists across Western Europe, instead of them launching an immediate attack on the Soviet Union. And they got no resistance across the bulk of Western Europe, because inside every Western European government, there was what they call the fifth column. There was a sizable section of the ruling class in every West European country that was sympathetic to the fascists, that welcomed their arrival, like as the best antidote to rising working class power, right?
If I may, throw something at you. You know what's interesting is how history is rewritten, because in France, what we hear about the Vichy government, right, and the way it's portrayed is they were just traitors. That the Hitler's forces came in and they were afraid of them, and that some people decided to fight back, but these people were just traitors and said, okay, the Hitler's people are in, so now we will, make hay for ourselves and take advantage of it as best we can. What has never been portrayed is that this was the element in France that was allied with Hitler. That there is some evidence that some of these people were working with Hitler and the German forces before the incursion into France even happened. So they never really come out and say, in France, there was a sizable element in the government that agreed with Hitler, and they worked with him because they were allied with him. And then they don't get into all of the countries that when the Germans came in, they went, hooray, Ukraine and Finland, etc. Yeah, glad to have you. Let's go ahead and ally. That's an element of World War II history that is written out, that there were so many people in the West, not people, elements, powerful elements of governments, and in some instances, entire governments that just welcomed the Nazis in and said, let's roll. We're down with you.
Yeah. Well, of course, Austria is the case in point there. They had what they call the Anschluss, this, they just literally rolled over and said, yes, come on in, take over. There wasn't, the people who disagreed just quietly went home. There was no big fight by the elements of the, if you ever watch that, it's a musical I absolutely love, The Sound of Music, right? I love the songs and I've loved it since childhood. It's a brilliant story and a lovely musical. But of course, it's set in Austria at this time, the time of the Anschluss, right? And it's in the home of an aristocrat who's been a high up member of the ruling class during the First World War in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, right? I mean, he's not an anti-imperialist by any measure. He is a part of, the ruling elite of Austria. But he's not friendly to fascism. He's not friendly to the idea of Austria becoming a satellite or a territory of a greater Nazi Germany, of the Third Reich. And what is ultimately his rebellion is just to try and stay at home quietly, right? He ended up running away because they were being, pushed where they couldn't just stay at home quietly. But he wasn't like out organizing the resistance with all of his contacts and military experience, was he? He was just like, well, we'll just sit quietly in our beautiful castle and hope that everything goes away, and I just won't be involved in politics. Well, the Reich wouldn't leave him alone, so then he did actually leave. But, you see what I mean? Austria, the Austrian section of the ruling class that didn't like what was happening, just basically kept quiet. And that film's a really nice illustration of that particular story that's so famous. Something that you highlighted with this question of the section of the ruling class in every country that was basically collaborating, sympathetic, already working with and ideologically aligned with Nazi Germany, because fascism is just one face of imperialist politics. It's one tactic for imperialism in crisis to manage its situation and stay in power, particularly when it is faced with a massive threat from the working class. When the working class is getting organized, getting dangerous, starting to present a threat, and you've also got economic crisis that is making the political and economic situation very difficult for the imperialists themselves. Fascism is their resort. They prefer, as I said, to rule at home with the velvet glove, as we talked about this before, the velvet glove of bourgeois democracy. But sometimes it's not possible. And then you have to get rid of the glove and get out the fist. And the mailed fist of imperialism in crisis, that is what fascism is. So in this situation, across Western Europe, there was crisis. Across Western Europe, there was a growing communist, militant working class movement. The system was genuinely in grave danger, not only from the economic crisis, but from its own working class and colonial peoples also. So there were fascists and fascist sympathizers in every country of the imperialist world and in many of their satellites. Meanwhile, in the Soviet Union, they understood that all of these things are not going to leave them untouched. All through the 30s, it was clear to them that a big showdown is coming. And one of the ways they prepared was part of the reason for their ability to fight so well and to win. And they never stopped, the Western historians and politicians never stopped castigating the Soviet Union for this. It's the Moscow trials. What were the Moscow trials? The Moscow trials were trials that were the culmination of investigations to find the fifth column in the USSR. Of course, they knew it existed. They knew there were people in the Soviet Union who had been actively collaborating with Western powers to try to sabotage socialist development. You know, they would blow up train lines and things like that, right? Saboteurs. But to also try to spread disillusionment in socialism, and ultimately who plotted with Western backers to try to find ways to destabilize and ultimately overthrow the Soviet system and the Soviet Communist Party from rule. And these included people like Trotsky, but various others. I'm going to forget the names, so I won't list them because I'll get them muddled up and wrong. Trotsky was one person who was famously, he was no longer in the country by this point, but he was famously unveiled as having collaborated with outside Western powers against the Soviet Union. But there were many people, and some of them quite high up in the party, in positions of power, you know, who were sitting, you know, outwardly displaying themselves as good Soviet citizens, but actually they were plotting against the Soviet Union, and they were in partnership with and sponsored by Western powers, sometimes British, sometimes German, you know, different people, different alignments. But the Moscow trials were the culmination of a big investigation to find out who are the people, high-placed people who are involved in these plots. And they found them, and they brought them to trial, and they got rid of them. And guess what? During the war, the Soviet Union did not have a problem with collaborators causing problems for them from the inside, which of course is very, very important. You know, you only have to look at what happened to France to see how important that is, because France was considered, you know, before the war was launched against France by the Nazis, everybody was like, oh, they've got this incredible fortification. It's called the Maginot Line. They're dug in. There's no way the fascists can get past that. They rolled over it almost without stopping, because the resistance was not properly organized, because they had chaos at the top and division at the top. The resistance wasn't properly organized. It had to reorganize itself after the country had been occupied under the leadership of, guess who? The communists, right? Because the ruling class was at sixes and sevens all over the place, not able to direct the defense of the country when it mattered. Half of them, as you said, just going off and straight away kind of welcoming the Nazis in and setting up the Vichy government, and the other half just kind of melting away in chaos. This is what happens when you have a prominent fifth column inside, you know, the leadership of your country at a time when you're under attack. So the Moscow trials are always held up to us as proof that Stalin's regime was evil, right? But in fact, the Moscow trials were proof that the Soviets were extremely sensible in defending their sovereignty against the machinations of outsiders, defending the country and their socialist system against the plots of the imperialists to come in and undermine and overthrow them. And they were extremely effective. So that was, I think the Moscow trials were 37, I want to say 1937. Apologies if that's wrong. So they were preparing in many ways. In fact, it's very interesting. In 1931, Stalin gave a speech, very famous speech, because it was so far-sighted and so incredibly predictive of what was going to come. He gave a speech to some it was a conference of Soviet business executives. And he said to them, comrades, you know, we've done an awful lot already, and we should be proud of ourselves and everything we've achieved, but we cannot sit on our laurels. We can't rest. In fact, although we've worked really hard, we now have to up the tempo. He said, why? He said, because we're 50 to 100 years behind the West, and we have only 10 years to catch up, or they will crush us. And that speech was made almost literally 10 years to the day before the Soviet Union was invaded by Nazi Germany, right? And in that 10 years, every second counted in terms of the Soviet Union's development of its and strengthening of its agricultural base, i.e. feeding the people, of its industrial base, of its military base, of its scientific and technological base, its cultural base, its, the education and training of its people, the ideological orientation of its people, everything they could do to strengthen the system and the country and prepare for the onslaught that they knew was coming. They didn't want a war. They were not aggressive. It's a bit like, the Russians today always being accused of, or the Chinese always being accused of being aggressive. They had to prepare for attack because they understood they live in a world encircled by imperialist powers who will never, while they exist, leave them alone. There's no such thing as peaceful coexistence with imperialism, because imperialism has war baked into its DNA from day dot, right? It just is incapable of existing without war, and it's incapable of allowing other social systems to exist alongside it. It is somehow like, oh, we all just live and let live. You do your thing, I'll do my thing. That is not what imperialism is. It's not how it works. It's not a feasible scenario. And all the people who've tried to tell us that it is have just been trying to put us to sleep, and stop us from doing what we need to do. So anyway, back to the story. Here we are running up to, so finally, because they call it the Hitler-Stalin Pact, but in fact it was signed by foreign ministers Molotov and Ribbentrop. So the Soviet-German Non-Aggression Pact was signed, and Hitler, Nazi Germany, instead turned their attention towards the rest of Europe. And having invaded Poland, they then turned west. And what that meant was that put them on a collision course, instead of with the Soviet Union, first with the British Empire. Now, at the time that Britain declared war on Nazi Germany, the position of all the communist parties, including the British Communist Party, was this war is an inter-imperialist war in which the workers have no side. So at that point in time, the workers of the world were not being asked to take sides between democratic Britain and fascistic Germany. They understood these are two sets of imperialists, and their real fight is about the colonies. And you can actually see that, because if you look at the majority of the fighting Britain did in World War II, it's in colonial countries. It's in Burma against the Japanese. It's in the desert against Rommel, to defend bits of Africa, right? It is about defending the empire and the right to monopolize territories of the world, right? This is why imperialism is called monopoly capitalism. First, because it comes out of the development of free trade capitalism into monopoly capitalism, when the economy has basically been transformed to one that's totally controlled by huge monopolies in every sphere of activity. And those monopolies have grown far too big to contain their activities within national boundaries. They need to expand across the globe. And part of how they do that is they grab territories and monopolize them, create monopolies, monopolize sources of raw materials, monopolize markets in which to sell and buy whatever. So, and of course, labor to exploit. So this fight from 1939 to middle of 1941 was characterized as an inter-imperialist war. In fact, it's interesting, if you look at the history of the British, what was the CPGB, Communist Party of Great Britain, those times, which in those years from its founding 1920 up until kind of 1950 was a revolutionary communist party of the best type, right? It was a good party, a good revolutionary party. I mean, clearly there must have been some issues with it because it went wrong very fast after 1950. But in 1939, they had to remove their general secretary temporarily. He kind of resigned and then was put back in 1941. The reason being, he found it very difficult to accept, although, his party did and the Comintern did, the line that this war is not the workers' war. In 1939, the line of the British Communist Party to the British working class was, it's an inter-imperialist war, and they're fighting over who gets to dominate the world. And this is not our war. Our job is to bring down our own ruling class, not to fight on their behalf so they can preserve their empire, right? Just like World War I. And remember, World War I wasn't that long ago at this point. All the people who fought in World War I were all still around. All the consequences of World War I were all still with people, you know, and it was supposed to be the war to end all wars. And here we are back in another one, you know. Then in 1941, having conquered all of mainland Europe, the Nazis broke the non-aggression pact and invaded the Soviet Union. But the Soviet Union had bought itself some vital time. It had, for example, moved its industry. I mean, this is the amazing things you can do with a planned economy that no other country can think to aspire to, right? We've seen when it comes to just the armaments production on really small scale in imperialist countries, you know, in the last 2 years with the proxy war against Russia going on in Ukraine, they talk about the need to expand production. But all the things you need to do to make that happen, like involve making lots of decisions about the way that many things are set up, and it involves taking a hit to profitability in order to do all those things. And you know, nobody's got the ability or the motivation to make those things happen. You need a whole load of state control to do stuff like that. I'm not saying you can't direct things like that in a capitalist economy, but you can see the advanced level of capitalism we have leaves them very disorganized when it comes to these type of big projects now. The Soviet Union, because it's a totally planned economy, they identified this requirement. We expect to be invaded from the West. Therefore, we need to put our industry beyond the reach of enemy bombers. So that is what they did. They literally picked up a whole load of the most vital factories and moved them beyond the Ural Mountains. I mean, you know, it's an impossible thing to imagine, you know, unless you're Chinese, right, and draw your own conclusions from that. Right? The Chinese can do that, right? Mobilize the state to execute such a plan with so much speed, right? But they did that. And that was, again, the planned economy was part of, a very important part of the Russian success in World War II. I won't go more into that, although I could wax lyrical about it for a long time. So coming back to the actual question of what happened in the war. So you see, at that moment, when Operation Barbarossa happened and the Nazi Germany invaded the Soviet Union, the character of the war changed. Because at that point, we had the most aggressive and vicious front of imperialism fighting the base of the world socialist revolution. And that became a cause for all of humanity to save the Soviet Union, was the primary task for the world's people. And therefore, workers who lived in countries that were allying themselves on the side of the Soviet Union were called by the communists to join the fight. So in the same countries like Britain and France, where they've been saying, no, that's not your war. Well, France was different, obviously. But Britain, they've been saying, it's not your war. Or America, it's not your war. Then they said, no, now we need to join the war to defeat fascism. Fascism is the most brutal incarnation of imperialism. And what is at stake is the future of the socialist revolution. And of course, the Soviet Union wasn't just for Russians or for people in that part of the world. It was the base of the world revolution, including the base of the world anti-imperialist movement. We've talked about this before, how the Soviet Union trained, armed, educated anti-colonial fighters from all over the world, right? So it was the base of everything anti-imperialist, and to lose it would be a terrible, terrible setback for the ruling class, for the working class, as of course, when we lost the Soviet Union, it was a terrible setback for workers and oppressed peoples everywhere. So the character of the war changed at that point, and it became known as the Great Anti-Fascist War. For the Soviet Union, it was the Great Patriotic War. But for the people of the world, the masses, of workers and oppressed peoples, it became a popular cause, the great anti-fascist war, which they all joined in. And this is why the folk memory of World War II is so different from the folk memory of World War I. Our folk memory of World War I is, what a waste. All those millions of people sent to their deaths in the most futile way for nothing. That's the kind of popular folk memory of World War I. World War II is that there was something moral and uplifting about that fight. Now, the ruling class in the West have done a great job of capturing that sentiment and harnessing it to their own mythology. So they've gone, oh yes, the great fight against fascism. That's what we all cared. We were all in that together. The great leader of that fight was Winston Churchill. The great leader of that fight was, who came before? Roosevelt. And Truman, well, not really Truman, was it? But, Roosevelt, Truman, these were the great leaders, the great anti-fascists, And of course, it fits with the mythology about Roosevelt to say that he was this great anti-fascist fighter. But this mythology has been spread in the minds of the working people. They have forgotten what everybody knew at the end of World War II, which is the Soviets defeated fascism in Europe, and the Chinese liberation fighters defeated fascism in Asia. Of course, side by side with them were also partisans from many other occupied countries. So one mustn't forget that. But they were the great leaders of those movements, and the Soviet Union was the great leader of all of them. The Soviet Union helped pretty much every single liberation force everywhere against fascism, from the Far East all the way over to the west of Europe. Every liberation movement was pretty much everyone was led by communists. Every one of them got support from the Soviet Union, right? So the Soviet Union was the great leader of the anti-fascist fight. It was the main victor of World War II. It was the Soviet Union that destroyed Nazi Germany. When the Soviet Union was first attacked, the imperialists were all telling everybody it's going to collapse in a few weeks. They've got nothing, because they'd been propagating these myths like they did about Russia a few years ago. It's just an Orwell with a flag. They've been propagating these myths that the Soviet economy was a basket case and that you can't possibly have a strong country based on silly communist ideas, right? They had to rewrite all their propaganda after 1941. Suddenly they found themselves in an alliance with the Soviet Union. They found their people unsure about this ally, and suddenly they're producing books. I won't look for it now, but I've got a lovely little picture book that was produced at that time in Britain called The Strength of Our Ally, and it's a whole load of pictograms showing you the incredible achievements of Soviet education, culture, industry, technology, weaponry, to kind of reassure the British people that actually they're not such a basket case as we've been telling you all this time. So these sort of truths started to seep out. By 1945, everybody knew that the Soviets had won the war. They turned the tables on the fascists. They fought them all the way back to Berlin, liberated the whole of Eastern Europe, allowed space for the partisans and popular movements that had led the resistance against fascism during those years of occupation to come to power without interfering, without the imperialists being able to suppress them back down again. That was why you didn't have people's democracies were not imposed by the Soviet Union, but because those countries were liberated by the Soviet Union, they had the chance to choose their own government without interference. And they did. And of course, they chose the people who had stood up for them against fascism, which was the communists. So you had a whole raft of new people's democracies as a result of the Soviet liberation from fascism. The reason that D-Day happened when it happened in 1944, all through, hard years of fighting against the Nazis and taking the full brunt of the Nazi onslaught, 90% of the Nazi armies were on the Eastern Front against the Soviet Union. Everything else around the world was like a skirmish. They threw everything they had. And at that time, nobody believed that anybody could stand up against the Nazi army. The Wehrmacht, it was the biggest, strongest army anybody had ever seen. There's no standing up to it. Most technologically advanced, the most ideologically driven, you know, and the kind of best equipped and organized, right? There's nothing that can stand in a way. That was the popular understanding of the Nazi war machine. The Soviets faced it down at tremendous cost to themselves. You know, unbelievable sacrifices of civilians as well as of armed forces, of partisans. The whole population really mobilized in this effort. Insane sacrifices the Soviet Union had to make in that fight. They were, at that time, Britain was supposed to be their ally. They kept promising, yes, we'll open a second front in Europe and relieve the pressure. They didn't do it. Why not? Because they were very happy for the Germans and the Soviets to keep fighting themselves. If Germany brought down the Soviet Union, so much the better. They were never a real solid ally. Everything they did, they were forced into, you know, by the Soviet Union. And it was all reluctant. It was all as little as possible. It was all cosmetic rather than substantial, the things that they did. They didn't open a second front when it could have relieved, for example, the siege on Leningrad, the Battle of Stalingrad, these huge titanic battles the Soviet Union faced alone. It was only when they turned the tide and the Nazis were actually, it was obvious they were defeated. Yes, it took a lot longer for the war to be over, for the final defeat to come, but it was clear which way things were going. After Stalingrad, after Kursk, there's that name again, it became clear which way things were going. Then, and only then, the Americans and the British got together and said, oh, we better launch a second front, you know. And why? Because if they hadn't, they knew the Soviet Union was going to liberate all of Europe. And you would have seen communist Greece, communist Italy, communist France, communist Belgium, communist Holland, right? All of it was going to go communist. Not because of the Soviet occupation, like the way they like to present it in the Western history books, because that would have been the will of the people. If they weren't stopped, that is what the people would have done. And the imperialists wouldn't have been able to stop them if they weren't on the ground with their boots. So that's why they launched the second front. We have to always understand that for the imperialists, their biggest enemy is communism, is socialism. Because, as I said, communism and socialism spells the death of imperialism. It is their future, and they're terrified of it. And hence they're terrified of the working class, because it's the working class that's going ultimately to depose them and build this new socialist future. So I'm sorry that was quite long-winded. Do you also now want me to talk about what happened after?
Yeah, we've got 15 more minutes. Yeah, I know a lot happened in Greece and Italy as an example, but yes, we got another 15 minutes. Love to hear it. You know, this is an educational video. I love this kind of stuff, and I'm sure there are a lot of people out here who have gotten the traditional propaganda on World War II, and it's good that they hear an alternative perspective of like what actually happened from that, because the let's face it, the history that we get is an imperialist history. And it paints the imperialist as good, working with the, to do the right thing, blah, blah, blah. Okay, so now we are after World War II, Italy and Greece and all kinds of things. And, continue.
So again, I'll do my best not to go on
Sure.
too much. Here we are. It's 1945. The anti-fascist alliance is victorious. But as we've seen, the anti-fascist alliance is not homogenous, and it's not all really anti-fascist. The Soviet Union was clearly, genuinely anti-fascist and anti-imperialist. The other powers were just wanting to bring down Nazi Germany and stop it from impinging on their empires. So what they really did not want to see was the spread of socialism across Europe. They couldn't stop the fact that it got into Eastern Europe, but as soon as even before World War II was over, they were conspiring together, the British and the Americans in particular, how they could stop the march of socialism around the world. Could they stop the Chinese Revolution? Could they stop the Korean Revolution? Could they stop the Vietnamese Revolution? You know, everywhere they looked, they were trying to stop revolutions that were happening. And of course, all over Europe, the same. In Germany, we had this situation where Germany had been, there was a line across Germany, which was where the Red Army met the Western imperialist allied forces. And the country ended up partitioned. It wasn't, the original plan hadn't been to partition it, but it was forced really on the country because the imperialists wouldn't leave. So you had a West Germany and an East Germany. The East Germany got its new socialist government. West Germany did not. And when we look at the development of West Germany, we see some interesting things. So, for example, everybody knows at the end of World War II, there were tribunals at Nuremberg where war criminals were put on trial. And of course, the Soviets were very serious about this. Soviets had suffered hugely from the horrific crimes of aggressive Nazi Germany on its territory. I mean, atrocities that you could take the rest of your life to enumerate and describe and be horrified by. But you know, think about the Zio-Nazis rampaging right now in Gaza, and you'll have a taste of what the Nazi occupation in places like the Donbass, if you want to know why they're such anti-fascists, look at their history, were like for the occupied people there. So they were very serious about the war crimes tribunals. The Britain, their allies, so-called, they're not so allies in Britain and America, had to go along with this to some extent. There was a popular demand, but at the same time, they wanted to preserve as many of the former, particularly high-placed officials as they could, because they were well-connected, part of the system, part of their system. They were allies against communism. And so they wanted to preserve as many anti-communist allies, foot soldiers and generals as possible. And they did. So if you look at that situation, some people were sent to Nuremberg, but many people were saved from Nuremberg. Some were just directly exported either to the USA or to South American countries, which are kind of USA's colonial empire, or they had their past kind of whitewashed for them, whitewashed and rewritten, so that they could be represented to the public as non-Nazis and placed into positions of power. And former Nazis were placed into important positions of power throughout the GDR, not GDR, but what was West Germany called? Whatever West Germany was called, I forget, Federal Republic of Germany. So throughout the Federal West German Republic, Nazis were placed in positions of power, having been kind of rinsed, whitewashed, put back out. They were placed in positions of power in the new NATO alliance, founded in 1950, no, 49? 53. 49. I get confused, my date sometimes. I think that was 49. Then there were Nazis put into positions of power in the newly founded area of economic cooperation that was the precursor to the European Union in Europe. All of these institutions and countries were set up to be bastions of anti-communism, to be essentially run by the USA, but with help from its junior partners in German imperial circles, in British imperial circles, in French imperial circles, right? They all became second fiddlers to the USA. USA was the only imperialist power that emerged from World War II stronger rather than weaker. So it became the leader of the anti-communist fight. It became the leader of the world world imperialist camp. The other imperialists had to rely on the USA for its economic might and for its war machine from the Second World War onwards. So their ability to keep pillaging the world started to rely more and more on American armed muscle rather than on their own after 2 world wars. You know, so this is a kind of historical development that we sort of have to recognize. And this we see this in our world today. You know, a lot of people interpret this to mean that Germany or France or Britain are now colonies of the USA. It's not true. You know, we are very much imperial countries, but junior imperial powers, and that all the imperialists, with the rise of socialism, kind of huddled together for protection to defend their system and save it from being completely subsumed by the spread of communism and socialism across the world. They had to huddle together and protect one another in order to protect the whole system of global looting. So you have this situation. So the USA everywhere, and in the East as well, they were in all the countries of East Asia, which had liberated themselves during World War II, like Vietnam, like Korea. The Americans came and rearmed the very people the liberation movements had defeated in order to reimpose dictatorship of imperialism in those countries which were going socialist. And they did the same thing in the West. They did it, for example, in Greece. Now, the Greek Revolution is a tragic story in Europe. And their tragedy was they were victorious too soon, because the Greek Revolution essentially was winning in some kind of 1944, when the World War II was not yet over. And they were officially in an alliance. The resistance forces of Greece were officially in an alliance with the anti-fascist Great Britain. Great Britain, which had always been a sponsor of every type of nasty regime in Greece against the people, the monarcho regime, the fascistic regime, the monarcho-fascistic regime, like all of them had British sponsors. You know, Greece had always been a kind of semi-colony, or for a long time, a semi-colony of Britain. A dependency. And so the partisans who had won their anti-fascist revolution, their liberation war, were kind of ready to go forward to a popular people's Greece. Because it was only 1944, they let the British in, because we're all on the same side. It was supposed to be to kind of finally disperse the remnants of the fascists. And the British began the process of attacking the revolution and drowning it in blood. They did not completely succeed. In fact, they were being fought to a standstill. They didn't have enough resources to do the job properly. Guess what? The Americans came in to finish the job for them. And a lot of people don't realize that, in fact, the first dropping by America of napalm on a resistant country was in the mountains of Greece in that revolutionary period. Post World War II, I think in the late 40s, they dropped napalm on Greek communist guerrillas in the mountains who they were fighting. And so between the British and the Americans, they drowned the Greek Revolution in blood. The revolutionary movement, which had, rescued their country from a terrible plight under fascism, under fascist occupation. I'm sorry because I will get the number wrong, but there's some horrific figure, like almost a third of the people were starving to death, because the Nazis literally occupied and said, well, we just need these resources. We need this food. Never mind if the people are hungry. And, the people literally starved in their masses to death under Nazi occupation. So these were the conditions under which they fought to liberate themselves. Having liberated themselves, their anti-fascist so-called ally comes along, says, yes, let me in. Let's all shake hands. Let's sign an agreement. Okay, by the way, you're out. It's a horrible story. In a slightly different vein, after World War II, you saw a situation like in Italy. So Italy, of course, was on the western side of what Churchill called the Iron Curtain. It had, unfortunately, not been liberated by the Soviets. So the popular wave of sympathy for communism was able to be subverted. In Italy, there it was done with money, which is another classic US imperialist tactic, isn't it? The USA basically flooded the post-war Italian election with huge influx of dollars. They spent an insane amount of money paying for counter-revolutionary, counter-communist forces, including working with mafiosi as kind of counter-gangs, to terrorize the workers and terrorize the communists. And they managed to subvert that election process and stop a communist government getting elected. So all over the post-World War II history has really been about crushing the people's resistance, crushing the people's popular revolutions, and regaining control of Europe for imperialism.
Wow. Well, I'm gonna. We're running just about out of time, but I'm gonna show people something a lot of Americans don't know. So, this is a building. Now, what's interesting is this article says the notorious history of California's still standing swastika shaped building, right? It's California's building. It's in San Diego, but here's what they leave out. The resemblance went unnoticed by the public, at least for decades, until Google Earth appeared and shed light on the very distinct shape of a building of a barracks at Naval Base Coronado. So it's not California's building. This building was built in the 1960s at a naval base, Coronado, California. Now, they claim, oh, well, gee, we had no idea that. Oh, what do you know? We built a building and it ended up shaped like a Nazi, but I've done some research on this. And what I found was there's historical evidence of the blueprints for the building, which when you look at the blueprints, you can see clearly that it was designed, and there's the blue, and you can see the signature where it's signed off on everything. So the bottom line is, right now, this very second that we are talking, there's a base in California, a U.S. naval base, and this is the shape of the building, which I guess, you could actually, if you look at the NATO official little points thing, yeah, there's so many things, and that leads me all the way back to this. Ukraine is basically the exact same thing as Germany, in that it seems to me the plan was we arm the Nazi Reich part, 2.0. We throw it at the Russians, and ideally both get destroyed because it's a useful tool, but afterwards, it's a little bad PR. So we throw this this political / military tool at Russia, and both get destroyed, and afterwards we can walk away being the good guys. It seems to me that Ukraine is almost exactly the same thing that they did with the Nazi war machine. Just a couple of minutes to your thoughts on that.
It's very, very similar for sure. You have an ideologically driven group of people who've been brainwashed and taken advantage because they're desperate and poor. Remember the ordinary German workers who were brainwashed into, serving their own ruling class by the Third Reich, by the Nazi ideology, were poor. They'd been through this period following World War. So they had World War I, which was catastrophic. Then they had the post-war reparations period, catastrophic. Then the Great Depression, catastrophic. Right? They were poor and desperate, and they were turned away from communism, many of them, and into fascism by demagoguery, which confused some of the communist slogans with putting together a kind of racial superiority theory that says you're actually the chosen people, and these people over here, in this case the Jews, are getting in your way. And you wrap all of that up together, and you arm people, and you make them feel proud, and give them and point them in a direction, and say, if you just get rid of those people over there, your future is going to be heavenly. So ideologically motivating poor and desperate people is something the imperialists are very good at. They produce proxy armies that way all over the world now. What we see is they don't tend to do it with their home population so much as they do with populations abroad. Their wars, their kind of moral high ground has been lost to the extent that the local populations really do not support their wars. They're not queuing up to join their armies. In the main, they have to present themselves as peace-loving on the world stage. And so they fight their wars through proxies, and they create these highly fascistic, ideologically motivated armies They arm them, they brainwash them, but they use their poverty and their lack of education and their desperation to find the people they're going to groom into being their proxy forces. And they don't care at all about them. They're totally expendable. Their job is, as you say, to clear the way for profit taking. But we shouldn't forget that this ideology that's used in Ukraine, ultra nationalism, and then that was wedded to the Third Reich fascist ideology. This has been a tool of the West to use Ukrainians with this ideology against Russia, against the Soviet Union, and against Russia again for like 100 years now. In fact, a lot of people don't realize that after World War II, Banderites, who were the Nazi-aligned fascists of Ukraine, continued, and they were famous for being particularly nasty kind of fascists. Like, they would do jobs in Ukraine against their own people, against Soviet Ukrainians, that even the SS Gestapo were a bit like, oh, that's a bit nasty, that job, burning down a village full of babies and old people. I'll send the Banderites in to do that one. They're like, yep, no problem, give me the match. They were notoriously kind of fascistically evil and brain dead when it comes to morality. Really, really vicious. These Banderites were maintained, groups of them were maintained inside Soviet Ukraine after World War II. It took the Soviet Union in Ukraine until 1953 to finally defeat the last remnants of those terrorists who were hiding out in the forests. Does that sound familiar? Hiding out in the forests and, doing raids and sabotage attacks against infrastructure and against people and villages and all the rest of it. Basically trying to instill terror in the local people because they weren't going to bring down the Soviet Union. But listen to this, same old strategy. The hope was they could demoralize enough people that it causes instability in the Soviet government. And somehow that contributes to a situation where you might get a regime change. Does that sound familiar to you, Garland? Does that sound familiar? Right. And they did the same in Poland. In fact, until 1953, the socialist governments in Ukraine and Poland had to keep fighting against terroristic elements who had been left behind, fascists left behind after World War II, and were being sponsored and armed and taken care of directly by the CIA. Directed and operated by the CIA all the way through up until that point. So much for being, anti-fascist allies. They never were anti-fascist allies. They were forced not to directly attack the Soviet Union by the cleverness of Soviet policy. It's another thing they will never, ever forgive Joseph Stalin for. He outwitted the whole bunch of them. He beat them. He beat them with his head. He beat them with his country's economy. He beat them with his military. He beat them every way it's possible to be beaten, and they will never forgive him. And he was not even one of them. He didn't even come from a posh family. He came from a colonized people. He came from a backward, an oppressed class. Nothing about him was acceptable to them and their narratives, So they don't forgive him for that. But this use of proxy forces to try to destabilize and motivating them with fascistic ideologies. We see it again and again and again. You see them trying to do it to the people of Taiwan, trying to make them believe that they're not Chinese and to hate the Chinese and to have a kind of superiority complex over the Chinese, so they're trying to create a proxy army. What they tried to do with Uyghur Muslims in Xinjiang, they take poor, uneducated, backward people, they groom some of them with an ideology that makes them feel like they're something superior, separate, special, and they train them and arm them and give them all the wherewithal to do, horrific terrorist operations against their own people, essentially. What did they do with ISIS in the Middle East? Exactly the same. It's all the same fascism. You can dress it up as Islam, as Christianity, as Judaism, dress it up how you like. What it is fascist ideology, supremacism, that tells one group of people that they are the chosen people and everybody else is not even a human being at all. You see it on display in Zionist Israel so clearly, but it's exactly the same ideology as the Nazis, exactly the same ideology as the Banderites in Ukraine today. exactly the same ideology that ISIS had in the Middle East, and the same ideology they're trying to feed to the Taiwanese people against China.
Japan. Also, that's the Japan, you know what I mean? Japan, superior, that they should rule over all, you're the ultimate Asians and you should rule over all Asians. And they didn't have to tell the Japanese that, too many times. They've been working on that. They've been working on that ideology for centuries of their own accord. Well, okay, Joti, where can people go to find all your stuff and follow you?
So my preferred social media platform is Telegram. And if you just search for my name, Joti Brar, you will find my Telegram channel. You will also find the channel of my party. And I do recommend people to follow that, because that is where you get the kind of analysis that informs the kind of things that I say. It's The Communists. So that's our website, thecommunists.org. And if you search for us, The Communists, on Telegram, you can also find all our stories are posted there and our videos. If you want to see our videos, we are Proletarian TV on YouTube. And we're also on Twitter and various places like that.
I had someone comment on Rumble, I think, Garland, I think you've been listening to that communist lady too much. And I'm like, well, only every chance I get. The thing about it is this. When we started talking, I had a bit of an idea about socialism, but I didn't know that much. But I'm a curious person and I want to learn about it. And, I have a history, of course, with my connections to the Paul Robeson, the Robeson family, the Paul Robeson family, and that legacy. And what I find interesting to ended up with this. And that is, I still remember a video I saw of this guy at this rally back when he thought Barack Obama was a socialist. How about that, right? And he said, he had a shirt on, Obama's a socialist. And this guy said, well, tell me, what is a socialist? And he goes, it's kind of like Hitler, kind of like Stalin. Let me call my brother-in-law, he'll know. And I thought, I don't really know that much about socialists, but that guy looks like an idiot. And I don't want to be him. You know what I mean? I don't want to say I love socialism or I hate socialism. And when someone says to me, so tell me about socialism that you learned from a proper socialist, communist, etc. What's the difference? What is socialism? What does that mean? I didn't want to be the person that says it's terrible, it's evil. Can you tell me about it? Well, I really don't know anything. And it appears to me
it's bad.
That's it's almost like a religious belief. You know what I mean? It's like an act of faith in the West that a belief of faith. Socialism is bad. What is it? I don't know. Well, how can you say it's bad? It's so evil that I don't even want to. Finding out would be evil. Knowing about it would be evil. So that way I can't find out.
You know what they really don't want you to know? That this person was the greatest practical Marxist-Leninist who ever lived. That he wrote books. That you can find out what he thought and what he did from reading his works, that they exist.
Gaddafi's book, the Green Book.
That they are written in the language for the masses. Joseph Stalin was an incredible communicator of Marxist science to ordinary people. He knew how to express things in ways that anybody could understand. And reading his works is a joy, in fact. And they have inculcated in us this reaction to the word Marxism, socialism, Lenin, Stalin, precisely to stop us finding out for ourselves, because embodied in these types of books is everything you need to know to start the process of liberating humanity.
Very interesting. Well, I'm trying to find out and learn so that, and I would say this to people that are watching, because people are like, oh, socialism's evil. They know nothing about it. I'd say in order to make that decision, whether Marxism or socialism is evil, you have to know it. If you don't know it, because what we have now in the West, it's been referred to by a friend of mine, Dr. Jim Kavanaugh, as a crisis of epistemology, right? Wherein basically the ruling elite wants you to take particular positions, but only have a very superficial at best knowledge of the positions that you're taking. And I see that so clearly doing radio, where people call in and they say X is true, X is right. And I say, oh, okay, well, tell me a little bit about X. Oh, well, how about Y? That's right. Well, you haven't even told me about X, but fair enough. Now you've gone to Y. Tell me about that. I don't know that much about it. Can you fill me in? And they go, And they don't realize that they've been given the words, but not the music. That they've been given these positions, and they take these positions. Stalin was an evil, horrible, terrible man. Tell me a bit about his life and the terrible things that he did. And I think he killed some people or something. You know what I mean?
Everybody knows.
Yes.
Everybody knows. So it must be true.
Right. And I'm like, well, not quite everybody, because I don't know. And apparently neither do you, but you're telling me. So at any rate, so that's
just finally on that point about making sure that you know before you reject something. Now, of course, I grew up in a house where my parents were communists, but I also grew up in Thatcher's Britain, in the southeast of England in the 1970s and 80s, right? So I was in one way prepped, in another way not prepped to become a communist, and I left home, went to university around the same time that the Soviet Union was collapsing. Right. So there were many things about life that didn't bring me to communism. But I did want to find out what was wrong with the world. And I could see that things were wrong with the world. And I did feel like one ought to do something about those things. And, the typical teenager, I was not really in favor of agreeing with my parents. It's not what teenagers want to do. Right. But by the time I got to the age of kind of 22 or so, I felt like, well, look, I've been looking around. I've not yet found anyone I do actually agree with, anyone who seems to be doing the right thing. So I thought, well, before I decide definitely that I don't agree or align with my father and his comrades, I better find out something about what it is they really think. And you know what I did, Garland? I went to a study class that was run by, in the house of some comrades, and my dad was there and other comrades. I don't remember what people always say, which book was it? I don't know. But it was Lenin. They were reading Lenin. And I sat with them and read Lenin for 2 hours. And by the end of it, I knew I was in the right place. Now, you could say, oh, your dad brought you into the movement. Well, in some ways he did. But what really brought me in was the truth. You know it when you see it. I was lucky to be around people who could put it in front of me. But I also had to approach that prejudice inside myself that said, no, that's not what you're looking for. Communism is wrong and your dad's just an idiot. And as a teenager, I'm happy to think, yeah, my dad's probably an idiot, But that bit of me that says, well, check. Look for yourself. What is it they're saying? Don't just have an emotional response based on all this conditioning. Find out. And all it took was 2 hours of sitting in that class, listening to the words of Lenin. And I was like, this guy tells the truth. This is what I'm looking for. That's what most of us looking for. We want to know what's true.
Yeah, and I'll end by saying this, because I know we're running out of time, and I grew up as a Black person in the United States in, same thing, 70s and 80s. I saw everything going on. And what I realized was with Americans, because things were going pretty good in America, so they trusted our government. But because of my understanding and my experience, what I realized during that time that was blatantly obvious to me was everything we were being told about freedom. We're free and everybody has these rights and freedom of this and all of these, because this is what America's told. See, those countries over there don't have freedom and democracy, and you've got freedom and democracy. And I didn't have freedom and democracy in the same way that other people had. So I realized it's all a lie. And even though, at some period, sure, my life got pretty, cushy, I'm not going to lie, but I still realized that there was a time when it wasn't. And I realized that what we were being told by our government about the goodness of America, the wonder, and that this was the place of milk and everybody here was treated well and fairly, and these other countries were evil and they were mistreating their people. I knew from my experience that it was all lies. And I just wanted to figure out what was really going on. And so that same thing, we had things that gave us an advantage point that was a bit different. So, well, thank you very much, Joti, and everyone follow Joti and share this on all your social media platforms. Thanks a lot. We got to run.